Welcome to Between Two Clinicians, the podcast that gives you a backstage pass to the mind of two therapists. I'm Talia.
And I'm Adam.
Let's get into it. Yes. Okay, cool.
Woo! Here we are.
I don't know if I figured that out right, but I think I did.
Oh, look, it actually said actual real recording.
Perfect. Well, here we are, actually really recording.
Yes. In our total realness.
Yeah, in Riverside County. No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, why the hell is she going? I was like, must be a baller place. Like, Riverside rewriting their history. Like, congratulations. Studio center of the world, Riverside County.
Yes, it's up and coming. You know, not a lot of people know about it. But
yeah, exactly.
The platform, Riverside, the platform. Oh, I'm excited. We've been leading up to this episode for what, 2 weeks
at
now?
least
Part 2-ish of last episode that we had a couple weeks ago. So I think we should I think as a short review, what we left off on last time was discussing what it's like to be in a family system where, if I recall correctly, like you wanting to see change.
Yeah.
You're making some of the first moves, potentially. You're seeing yourself differently. And so we talked about the theme is replanting the family tree.
Yes.
So that's what we're going to dive into today. So I am curious to see what you're going to take us away with, and then I will fill in as I do.
Absolutely. Well, so this thought process hit me like one day. I was literally working with a client, and I was like, I was recognizing that sometimes, well, not sometimes, every time, we don't get the ability to choose who our family is, who our blood is, where, we were actually raised as children, certain demographic things that we might experience. But then there seems to be this structure that gets put in place of like, well, I have to stay where everyone else wants to be grounded.
Yep.
And sometimes you look around and you're like, well, wait a second, we don't have the same desires. Like, before this podcast, Talia and I were talking about home ownership and like, when do you jump in the market? When don't you jump in the market? What do you want to do? Am I going to rent forever? Am I saving money? And so a lot of times we can look around and maybe our families aren't on the same cohesive financial page when it comes to like what our expectations are for one another.
True.
And that's why I came up with this idea of saying I wanted to invite people to replant their family tree. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're going to have to recognize this is actually not the most conducive soil for me to grow in, nor do I feel like this is going to be something that is going to be sustainable. So I'm going to need to actually replant my family tree. Now, some people go, so the whole family? I'm like, no, you are one of those acorns that fell off the branches, right? But as you've been developing into your own entity, now it's time to actually uproot yourself and go, okay, I'm going to go plant myself maybe where there's going to be a different level of prosperity. Mm-hmm. And this isn't going to be like the prosperity gospel. I'm not Joel Osteen. I'm just saying that, like, if you recognize that, wait a second, I am standing around a bunch of people that we are not in the same alignment with what our goals are.
Great word.
If I stay here, I'm not going to magically get to what I desire to get to. I mean, it's the law of the sixes, right? If you sit with 6 millionaires, most likely you will become the seventh. If you sit with 6 people who complain about work, you will largely be the seventh that doesn't show up for work. Like, you start to take on the characteristics of the people that you are hanging out with. Mm-hmm. And it's a rough thought process. People don't like thinking about it that way. And I don't want to dismiss anyone who may have their own challenges, but don't let someone else's experience of trauma be a justification for your lack of growth.
And staying in, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because staying in those patterns, I know a lot of the questions I've had myself, and when making those decisions, and people I've worked with and friends along the way, it's this balance of like, it takes a village, depending on what your family looks like, that you may or may not be considering uprooting or relocating. But also, if you do stay and you do have this proverbial village, it's a consideration. What kind of stress might it be if it's a dysfunctional family system? So yes, you have a village, but at what cost? Yes, there might be available resources. Have you checked in with your extended family that they'd be willing to provide and fill in that way? Or are you staying in this area? This is just one part of like where you're maybe choosing to plant yourself. Oh, well, I'm going to stay here because my in-laws, my this, my that. What if you come to find out they're like, yeah, we're not going to help you with that. Or they overpromise, underdeliver.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for that as well. Like definitely raising a family with a village. The village doesn't have to be your family of origin, and it can be something that you build over time and then maybe nurture in a certain area and then replant once you have it strongly contained. It's, I think, easier when it's just you, like when you're re-raising yourself, like when you're reparenting yourself, to be like, it takes a village. I will have my friends, my therapist, my this, and I'm going to replant somewhere healthier to get away from some of these really negative messages that I know, even we've talked before, obviously very candidly off air, that I've had to rewire even in my own family system. And it's not out of malice. It's out of potentially not having different skills, not knowing any better because they were never taught. Like there's so many things passed down through generations that I don't think are intentionally like, I'm going to really screw over my kid by giving them these messages. We go with what we know. And if we're not choosing to like have a CEU update or continuing education, I think is what like CEUs they call them now for us as therapists and other professions. If we're not taking it upon ourselves to learn differently, we stay stuck in that soil. Like you said, I love that analogy, metaphor. I can never keep them straight. We stay stuck in that soil that might keep us really stagnant, or might not have the proper lighting, or might not have the proper irrigation or watering or whatever it might be. If we go in different, more nutrient-rich soil where it's not being spread out among so many people, metaphorically, then we thrive. And it's scary to do that. I imagine it's scary when pollen or whatever, you know, when bees take pollen and repopulate, where it's just like flying through the air and it's like, ah, and then it re-lands and we're like, okay, we're on soil, we're on ground, we can do this. It's scary in the beginning. Well,
so this is kind of funny. So you bring up bees, and bees are actually like, they're a hobby of mine. So there's I
knew you were a beekeeper.
So here's the deal. Like, I don't have any active hives right now, but here's something that you're talking about. And do you want fresh honey? Adam's honey is all natural and available to you, fresh from Tennessee. Yeah. That would be terrible. But so there's actually something called a hive split. And so what happens is sometimes there can only be one queen in a hive at a time. What will happen is naturally towards the end of a queen's life, a queen will naturally produce a successor. But what's interesting is that when that successor is produced, you normally have a hive split. And what will happen is some bees will still have allegiance to the old queen, and other bees will have allegiance to the new queen. So what happens is, like, whenever people, you always see it on Facebook and whatnot, like, oh my God, there's a bee swarm on a tree. Normally there's two reasons. Either it's a really hot day and the bees actually decided to take a vacation for a moment because they'll overheat if they stay in the hive, or you'll see a hive split. What happens is that swarm is surrounding a queen and they're moving together to try to find that new place they're gonna call their own. But what's interesting about that is when hives split, there's a high percentage that don't survive based off of, are we going to find a place to settle down? Now, what is interesting is that those that do find success normally go on to be extremely productive hives.
Look at this.
So, like,
from the bees,
there is a tremendous risk for bees to get out of their hives and move on. Some of them don't make it, but then there are those that you recognize, like, holy cow, super productive, went on to have multiple generations, made it through winters, did all sorts of crazy things. So this thought process is normally when we are thinking about how do we maintain our own mental, physical, emotional health, we go off of the assumptions of other people.
True.
We go, oh, well, remember that didn't work out for my aunt, or that didn't work out for my mom or my sister or my brother. But what we are thinking about in that is we're applying their structure of their own hierarchy to our life. And we're saying, oh, I'm not going to have those same resources, or I'm not going to have that same determination, or we undermine our own process. And then we almost use time as a justification. Well, this is okay. It's not terrible. It'll do. I don't know about you. I'm not okay with living an okay life. And
Yeah,
so
I'm not in the land of, well, this will do.
yeah, we get one of these, right?
Yeah,
You know,
as far as I know, this is it.
yeah, exactly. I'm only working with the information at hand. But stop living your life like you have multiple lives. Like, this isn't Super Mario. And so there is times where you're going to have to decide, I have to actually uproot and move. Now, when we were talking last week about how systems can become hostile to that, a lot of times the communication that they're sharing with you is not rooted in actually what's going to happen to you. It's their own projections of why they didn't do it for themselves.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I see that all the time in therapy with family systems, or when I'm doing parent or family consults and the client is aware of it. It's not like behind their back. And there's this fear coming. What if this? What if that? And I'm very comfortable with playing the what if game. All right, what if that happens? And what if that happens? And then what if that happens? And we're like 9 what ifs in, and you're like, I'm starting to see how unrealistic this is. I'm like, I'm glad that we played this out, though. It's almost like an aversion therapy of like, let's or exposure therapy. Let's do this, and then you know that it's really unlikely. Not that the fear is invalid. Sometimes the fear is coming from, I lived through this before. I don't want someone to go through this again. And sometimes the fear is, I was always told this was going to happen or not happen, and I'm just living in this constant fear that's going to come true, almost like a oral history tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation, either lived through or only feared to be lived through. And that's not always the case. Oftentimes it is the projection of the parent or the family system that's like, well, you know who cousin so-and-so left the thing and they never talked to the family again, or they were in poverty, or like you only hear the negative. Similar with marriages. Well, they're miserable where they're this, because most of the time happy people, first of all, don't want to share their happiness with miserable people, and they don't feel the need to brag, or to even if it's not bragging, they don't feel the need to share it because they're like, we're happy. Like, I don't need to complain. This is like the science of why Yelp exists. There's a lot of 1-star reviews because wronged people are really pissed off and they want to share their pain. And then there's people who are like, this was the most delicious meal I've ever been to, 5 stars. And who knows if they've been incentivized or not. But we only really talk about things if we're extremely pissed off about it or extremely overjoyed about it. And that middle ground of like, it might be risky for you to replant your family tree. What are some of the pros, though? Like, let's sit neutrally and think of the pros and cons. So it's not like you're saying only these projective negative experiences. Like, well, I had it this tough, so will you. Or it failed when I did this, or so will you. Same thing with the generation we're seeing now. Well, back in my day, we just bought a house and this and that. That's not feasible anymore. Thank you very much. It's not really the exact same as it was in 1940s and 1950s. I wish.
You know, something I laugh so hard is like, I have a friend that his parents, their first house that they purchased in Fullerton, like one and done. Yeah. Bought this house. This house, they then turned around and sold it like a year ago, like $1.5 million. They bought the house as both being checkers at Ralph's.
Wow.
Now, again, they bought it in the 70s. But again, you were both checkers at Ralph's, and they went on to have amazing careers after that. But like, again, no one who is delivering Amazon packages is able to then go out and buy that same house. Right.
True.
So, but we can get stuck in the why nots. I'd rather get moving into the action side of it. Of like, I think the other big fear is people when they go, okay, Adam, well, you're telling me that I'm going to have to start creating boundaries with people that I love. Yeah, boundaries doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to be a high voltage fence that keeps everyone away. Yeah. What it really means is like, hey, maybe I'm not going to let you into certain areas of my life. Like, why am I taking financial advice from someone who's maybe on their 3rd divorce, 2nd bankruptcy, like doesn't have any savings for their like let's actually quote the source. Like, I don't think that's rude. Where I'm hearing a lot of people going, oh, wow, well, you're so judgy and so shame-based. And it's like, no. I'm just saying that if I'm going to take advice from someone, I'd like to take that advice from someone who's actually put it into practice.
That's good advice is don't take someone's advice unless you'd want their life. Not in like a creepy, you're going to steal it. Like, could I see being happy and joyed or overjoyed with what this person has? Do I trust their judgment because, like you said, they've applied it to their own life? And that's kind of why therapy, I think proper therapy is ethical and not giving like, well, you shouldn't do that and you should do this. It's what would it be like? Okay, let's play this scenario out. And if you do appreciate their feedback, it's neutral. It's not that we're never allowed to give advice well timed and after you know a client.
Yeah.
Going to a source where you appreciate their life, you appreciate what they've built. We have emotional regulation skills, whatever it might be. Teach me. I want to be taught from somebody who is living this message, not just reading it out of a book or saying one thing and doing another. Incongruency builds mistrust. It doesn't build trust. If I'm telling you, put X amount of money, or if somebody came to me and they're like, how did you save this much or whatever it was? And I gave them like my not saying everybody, but here's the 5-step plan I used. If it's of any help, full transparency, see if it applies to you. And they might be like, oh, I don't have that much to put away. Okay, maybe you can put this much away. The act might still be good. It might be the amount that's different. Like that is where I think going in the growth direction, to your point of like, it's still worth replanting, even if you can't do it to the exact blueprint. The motions that get you to the point of somebody that you're trying to take the advice from who you admire makes a lot of sense, rather than feeling like you can only go to your family who may be in financial trouble or romantic trouble or whatever else. You don't want their life, or you don't want what you're getting advice on. Don't go to that person for that advice.
Really well said. I mean, sometimes we get stuck in that obligation mode. I'm supposed to listen to them. Yeah. Or they tell us how much they've sacrificed for us, and so we need to do this for them now.
Only this.
And that's, I feel like that's one of the most toxic traits of like family relationships, is whenever we start moving into that shame-based resentment mode, like you're obligated to do something like that. I'd want to encourage anyone listening to this, and I know it's not going to be easy, but as soon as someone brings obligation into the conversation, I think that's your moment to realize this is not a healthy conversation.
No, it doesn't. If it's you owe me this verbally, or the vibe of it, or look at all I've done for you, after all I've sacrificed for you, this is the thanks I get after we made all these choices that I never asked you to make. Like, exactly. I think putting it in perspective and what you're saying, and because I've been in some conversations like that myself, it's like, oh, this is where we're at. Okay, we got to end this respectfully. Yeah.
Well, no, I remember having a client that was really struggling with her career, and it almost seemed like she wouldn't really commit to any one of her thought processes. And I was like, what is it just seems like you're self-sabotaging at a certain extent. What's going on here? And then the client was able to articulate that they had a parent that was putting tremendous stressors on them of like, well, none of the things that you want to do is in the medical field, and we want you to go into the medical field. And the client was saying, but that, like, she had actually gone through quite a bit of the schooling to be in the medical field, determined that it was a burnout center for her. She wasn't going to enjoy it. But then she was now using those same sort of like shame-based voices to deter her from fully committing to things that she thought she could do well. And what's amazing is, last time I had checked in with this client, I mean, they're doing tremendously well with their own business, doing their own little niche thing. Everything's fine. But what was that deterrent from the parents? Now, I can understand the parents, a lot of times we react out of fear. We want the best for our children. So well, if you do that, like, what happens if there's another shutdown or COVID? Like, the medical workers were always working, and that might not, like, but that's if we're living life based off of fear. True. And fear is a terrible prophet, right? It does not tell the world the reality of what's going to happen. It's really locking down to a mental rigidity of like, these are the only outcomes that could happen. Which I think for probably many decades prior to this decade, COVID notwithstanding, was true. We lived in a very war-torn or war-fearing area. What could go wrong? What could fail? What could this, like getting hit after hit after hit? That was a very, I would imagine, real reality for a lot of people and passed down generationally. It makes sense in context of that person's lifespan and upbringing. I think the
intellectual aspect of the advice and the feedback is ideally trying to hear the truth underneath. Oh, my parents don't want me to do this. Oh, my family doesn't want me to do this, or they don't want to do that. If possible, and even I've worked with clients on this, can we dig deeper? What do you think the message is that they're trying to send you? If you could interpret it and translate, it might not be what's actually being said. What are they trying to convey? Maybe incorrectly or better said, they don't want me to fail. I can get behind that. I think that might be a kind thing for a family system to not want someone to fail. However, there's a way to go about saying it that I can hear it better.
Yeah.
If you're not wanting me to have access to whatever you've set aside, let's say I've worked with a lot of families where there's like an inheritance or like a savings plan or a school, whatever it is. It's not like a 529 where you can only go to certain things, but they're like, we set this aside for you, but only to medical school. We set this aside for you, but only it's a control thing. And I encourage clients to ask whenever money or advice comes involved, what are the strings attached?
You have to ask that question.
What are you expecting in return? And sometimes the parents or whoever are like, I didn't even think about that. I recommend taking some time to think about that because there might be even unvoiced expectations. Well, my hope was this, but really that's not fair to place that on to place it on them after they've already agreed to whatever the help might be or the feedback or advice might be. Well, I didn't tell you this to you to go to turn around to betray your family and start a business and not pay us back. It's like, whoa, that went a lot deeper than we were planning on.
Yeah. So then your sacrifice wasn't a sacrifice. If you were making an investment, you weren't making a sacrifice. Like that, because I do hear that a lot from clients that either they went to private schools or they went to private colleges, higher education, then all of a sudden it gets weaponized against them.
Yep.
And I think, again, we have to pay attention to this. I appreciate where you said, let's break it down and hear what they're really saying. And I agree with you. It's parents being fearful if we don't want our children to experience certain things. But then sometimes it moves into a context that's not healthy. Yeah. It's no, you should do this based out of control. Like something I was looking up why you
would, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something that we have to bring into consideration with this is, I was looking up while you were talking, like guess how many jobs an average millennial will have over their lifetime they're projecting?
Lifetime being how many years?
Let's see here. Well, they're saying like 25 to 70.
Okay. 15?
Not bad. They're projecting 12. Is what they think.
It wasn't too far off. It
wasn't too far off at all. Where they talk about the generations before that, the boomers had 3 to 4, and the ones before that had 1 to 2.
Yep.
Well, so now let's listen to the fear, though. The fear is coming from parents who have probably worked at places for 15, 20, 35 years. It's not the reality that we live in. The world that my parents grew up in does not exist for me.
Yes.
And that's why I have to go ahead and replant my family tree at some point in time. Like, it's not about me desiring not to be with my family. I have to find a level of success for myself so that I can have my own family.
I completely agree. You and I are very similar in that way. I know we've talked a lot about that.
Because like I come out of the blue collar world. I love the blue collar world. I think trades are actually finally getting like some actual spotlight activity where people are starting to see like, oh, they're not a bad gig. No, you can put a family through life on a trade. But what's interesting is that a lot of times, what were we taught when we were in school? Like, oh, you don't want to have a manual labor job. You don't want to do this.
Down upon.
It was like, you got to go to school. You got to go to school. And then what happened? The whole pipeline got clogged up with bachelor's degrees that essentially turned into GEDs and masters that essentially turned into, associate's degrees. Yeah. And now we're in this situation where, oh, what do I do? I think that we have to own some level of why didn't we take our own responsibility in that? I think a lot of us, we got to the end of the road, and I can sit with you in the frustration of having student loans, of having done a long process. And then, sure, people were telling me this is going to happen to you. Like, I still laugh about when I signed for my graduate student loans. I'll never forget looking at the repayment, going, wow, $450 a month, that's going to be kind of rough. And that person telling me, don't worry, you'll be making like 10 grand a month, you're not going to have a problem. Now, what's funny is I've made that reality happen and more, but before that was based off of what? Some other person just telling me what my life was. Like, I need to take responsibility for the fact that I wasn't doing my own research. And maybe that's where you're at right now, is you're starting to wake up to certain realities of like, well, wait a second, I was told it was supposed to be different. Well, then did you do what you've done to get to this point here based off of what you wanted to do or what you were told you should do? Because if you stand here based in going, no, this is what I wanted to do, it's a lot easier to make that $450 payment than it is, well, wait a second, I was told this was going to be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and even making big life decisions, sometimes, I mean, this is kind of the case for seeking outside counsel, whatever it might look like, where the recipient or the beneficiary, where the beneficiary of, this is coming to me in lifetime, seeking outside counsel, where the beneficiary of whatever the decision is from that counsel is not the person giving the counsel. I think that's the feedback.
Really well said.
Going with your family or asking your family for advice, despite the function or dysfunction of your family, I do believe there's something innately hardwired in us to try to seek comfort and safety and familiarity from our family of origin, our family system. I know this is haywire. This is like a very generalization, obviously, to be redundant. If I'm going to you because I love and trust you, but I'm blinded by the love and trust that I don't see there's all this dysfunction. If I don't want that life, why would I be asking for feedback? You can ask for feedback for other things or say, hey, I made this decision. I just wanted to bounce it off someone I don't need. Like, there's a structure. This is how I teach clients, is like, when you're young, often you go to your parents for everything. What's right? What's wrong? What should I do? What could I do? So-and-so is this, and you ask a lot of questions. And then in the teenage year, that adolescent shift, kind of this pushback is, well, why should I? It's not what should I do? It's why should I do this? And trying to determine your individuation. And then as you get older and you're more comfortable making your own decisions without parental or outside counsel, in that sense of like almost dependency, you can then arrive at sharing, here's the decision I made. So it's like, what should I do? Why should I do it? Here's what I've done. And that's the hierarchy that I work a lot of clients through, that they're terrified to make their own decisions because what if it's wrong? What if I'm not loved? What if I don't love myself? What if a decision is a decision? You can always make another one. It may not be the exact one that you wanted in the beginning. There's a reason why, I believe, and this is not, this is excluding all of the like tragedies and abuse. There's a reason why you are making this decision. You may not see it right away, but years later, it might come true. And I think looking at like student loans, for example, nobody counseled me on that. My parents didn't tell me that this is a terrible idea to take out X amount of money at 21 for your doctorate. What are you doing? Like, nobody came in and told me that. I wish they had. I may have chosen, even if I had chosen the same thing, at least it would have been a more conscious choice. That's part of replanting the family tree also. Even if I were already going to make this decision, somebody else telling me or not telling me to do it, I chose it. Here is what I'm choosing. I'm not open for feedback on it. We're at that third level. I've informed you. I'm not open to be convinced. I'm not going back to the elementary childhood way of questioning of like, what should I do? And so many times, because parents do struggle, especially with as we get older, them losing more power and control over us, or watching us individuate and potentially leaving and not coming back because they have to face not having cultivated. Like, is your goal of parenting to just get your kid out of the house at 18 or 20? Or is it for them to want to come back and you to cook dinner? And do you want a relationship with them when they're in adulthood or not? I would say reverse engineer that. That will dictate a lot about how you parent. And don't treat your children as though they are kids of like, well, you shouldn't do that. It's this episode of Boy Meets World. I don't know if you ever saw that show.
Oh, I love Boy Meets World.
Okay, the episode where Corey and Topanga move out into that first apartment, and it's like the shitty brown water, the kids just scream. It looks awful. And the dad, I think his name was Alan. I don't know. The dad was like, you wanted to be an adult? I'm not going to help you. And Corey's like, but you this and the that, and then the piping and the whatever else. And he goes, no, you wanted to do this. You have to figure it out, son. It's on you now. Like, you told
I
me
do remember that
I'm
episode.
going to give you this, and he fixed it, and he was so it makes tears in my eyes. He was so proud of himself when he invited his parents over, and he's like, I fixed that. I did that. And to have pride in something that you've created and you've
Yes.
chosen for yourself is one of the it brings chills. I get speechless thinking about what it's like to have created something that
Mm-hmm.
I like. I'm sure you can relate to this too. It's like, I built this. It's not that I didn't have,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like I had no outside counsel. I'd have coaches or mentors or whatever along the way.
Yeah.
I dedicated myself to building my businesses. I dedicated myself to making investments and amassing certain savings and everything else. I chose that for me. I didn't need to feel the fear. And there was a lot of grief along the way who I didn't get to be and who I didn't get to be viewed as, and how much
and who I didn't get to share it with, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that is a rough part of being able to be like,
there's
I wish
grief
I could.
in replanting
yeah.
your family tree.
Oh yeah, and what's funny, because my grandfather's an arborist, is like, so like that.
Secrets do you have? You're not
There's like a ton of secrets, but anyway, so like when we say replanting the family tree, it's like, oh, Adam, that's so easy. Well, no, actually, it's not easy for the tree, because the tree actually goes through shock. When you move the tree out, it goes through shock, and that's why you have to be very intentional on how you plant a tree, because that tree has to be put in the right spot with the right like drainage. It's hysterical to talk about this, but you prep where you put that tree, because if you don't, then maybe that tree won't actually be set up for success. And then that tree not surviving wasn't based off of the tree not wanting to live. It was whether or not you actually prepared it to.
Yep.
So the other idea is, when I talk about moving yourself out of certain orchards of despair, of poverty, of all sorts of things, we have to recognize that there's also the thought process of you could have become root bound. What root bound means is when a tree is planted, like when they grow them to actually ship them around the world, they place them in different size containers. Now, they're not necessarily the what I'm going to tell you, but there's like a 35 gallon and a 50 gallon, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. No matter how big that container is, the tree will eventually die if you don't plant it. And I mean, it will go on for 15 years probably and live, but it will eventually die. People are always like, why? Because it became root bound. It wasn't able to actually spread out its roots. It wasn't able to survive. And so sometimes when you feel that anxiety well up inside of you, when you can feel your own intuition being like, I don't think I'm exactly where I need to be, that might be your intuition telling you you're root bound. Like, we don't actually have enough room to survive here.
Yeah.
What they're telling me that they will give me is not what I need to keep thriving.
Yes.
And so what are you going to do? Are you going to just prune yourself? Are you going to keep on clipping parts off of yourself to appease others so that, oh, I might be able to exist? Like, and there is this whole side of life where when you actually decide, I'm going to take and be deliberate and diligent, and I'm going to go ahead and plant myself somewhere other people couldn't see me thriving in, and then you actually cultivating a life out of that, it is infectious. Like, I have no problem sharing that a person that I was really going to for some mentorship when I decided to start my own business was my dad. I've always had a good relationship when it's come to like logical thought processes with my dad. And my dad was massively afraid for me. He said, son, you're married, you're trying to buy a house. Like, how are you going to get financing for a house? How are you going to do this? How are you going to pay your health care? How are you? And it was like all of a sudden sort of being like flushed back through a book that I read once called Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Oh, yep. I've read that book.
Where I'm telling you, it's a great book to read if you're trying to put together that financial side of your life. But what I could hear is, it wasn't my dad didn't want me to have success. I could just hear him saying, I'm so scared for you. Because it was largely something he had never done for himself. My dad is very much he's had 2 or 3 jobs his whole life. He's just a good, solid dude. He doesn't get fired. He does fine. But this idea of like, oh, but what if and what if and what if? And what I found was, sure, there were a lot of answers that I had to answer in starting my own business, where to get healthcare, how to do certain things, how to send up my first business account, how to do my own taxes. Like, there was a lot of things that I had to do. But what I found was the burden of working for something that I wasn't aligned for was greater than the burden of trying to achieve the knowledge to fix the problems that I was encountering. And so I'm not going to tell you it's easy. There's been a lot of nights that I've cried. I haven't been sure. I've gone to my wife. I've been like, I don't know what the fuck we're doing. I think I'm taking us backwards. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, when I moved into Tennessee, we were set to buy a house in 6 months, and we were ready to go. And I lost a job. I moved on the idea of this job is going to be perfect, right? I put all my eggs in a basket for a job, and it wasn't the right thing to do. And I got here. I realized a job was a joke. I wasn't getting paid. We had essentially spent our house fund on the first year of just trying to survive. And then it was like, I have no other option but to believe in myself. It was to believe in myself, or again, sell my soul to someone else for maybe a little bit more money. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to bet on myself. Because for every job up to that point, I had always bet on someone else. I had bet on different supervisors. I'd bet on different group practices. I'd bet on all these other people. But now I was going to actually invest in myself. And what I'm going to tell you is that's probably what you're up against right now. Your question might be, ooh, what's that next external variable I can find that can make me feel better? And the reality is, you are not going to get anything external that's going to fill the hole that's internal. You're going to have to buckle down and really go, what do I want for myself? And now how can I align myself with things that will help me get there? And that's what it means to replant your family tree. Because you can look down your row and you can see exactly how everyone's growing and what type of things they're experiencing and how long their life is and whether their life is the one that you want to live. Or you can have the courage of deciding, you know what, I think it's time for me to try something different.
Yeah, I remember as you were talking, it took me back to a conversation I had with my brother years ago. And I get choked up in a good way talking, even if it was in a sad way. It's totally okay. Emotions are not right or wrong. Self-therapy in action.
Oh my gosh.
I remember talking to him about halfway through grad school, being a therapist, obviously. I was like, yeah, I don't think there's any money in therapy. I'm terrified to own my own business because what I grew up with and the hills and valleys, and what if I'm in poverty? Like, there's so much fear coming up. And I was like, I have always had an innate sense for justice. I like structure. I like routine. So halfway through, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to do therapy, but also go into law enforcement. And I started that track. The process was very far along. And I remember going through so much of an identity shedding and shift with my own therapist at the time, replanting, because they were in the interviews, was anybody in your family in law enforcement? Is any this? And I'm like, no, this is like a deep burning desire for justice, for this, for that. And I remember my dad telling me it's not a justice system, it's a law enforcement system. So prepare to be frustrated. It was a good old boys club at the department I was hiring or applying for. And I remember being so grateful along the way that actually didn't work out. But while I was going through, like, obviously now I look back, I'm very grateful. I'm where I'm at. Despite, I tell people that, they're like, I could see you as a cop. I'm like, thank you. I'm aware. I have a very strong personality and I'm tough and I take shit from no one, but also I channel that into advocating for my clients. My dream for why I wanted that job was the structure, the routine, the respect, the shift, the uniform. Like, it felt so safe and contained. Like, you're going to get paid $5,000 a month no matter what, which to me at the time was like, oh my God, I could actually have financial stability and freedom and not be on food stamp. Like, it was eye-opening to me halfway through grad school. And I remember talking to my brother and I broke down. I was like, I'm terrified. I don't want to end up like this family member that I was thinking of, like we were talking about earlier, like the story and this. I'm like, I think I'm going to fail at it. I'm going to this. And my brother, I thank him for this because I don't think I'd be where I'm at today without, and I've talked about this in like magazine interviews and stuff too. And if you're listening, I love you. Thank you for doing this for me. And he said, I don't think you're going to end up like that person. You have something that people know what it is. This other person is trying to sell or make business of things that people don't know. So that's a double bind of, here's this thing I'm trying to convince people to buy or do or explain, and I'm also trying to sell it. People know what therapy is. And even if they don't, that's something they can Google. Like, you have this passion, you have this drive. Why not try? Like, why not try and open your business? And I'm so grateful that I had that conversation, because I don't think that I would have been where I'm at with this family tree and everything I've built the last years since that. I wouldn't have done it without somebody telling me, like, take the chance. Like, it's okay if you don't do what the family wants you to do. And I remember having a conversation with my dad in the park, and after like so much of grad school, he's like, I'm just so with law enforcement, he's like, I'm so happy you finally found a career that you love. And I looked at him, I'm like, therapy, fucking therapy. Like, I already found one. This was just a convenient detour for me to grow more in therapy. Like, are you? And it took a while for him to come around to it, because he was very like turned off from therapy. Believe blah blah. And then I remember one day he came to me crying, and after he saw my website, and he's like, I had no clue that this is all that you've built, because I didn't want to share it with him, because I didn't want the kind of the tarnish of all the feedback. But like, replanting the family tree for me was terrifying. I remember like nights crying, months crying, mentors, I'm deathly afraid. What if it fails? What if it this? What if it grows? What if it continues? What, like, it's hills and valleys when it comes to an identity shift. It'll push on you unlike anything else. And I had to shift how much I went to my parents. I had to shift what I talked to them about. I had to shift who I was surrounding myself with, and getting further and further away from it and putting it in perspective changed my life. If you're listening to this, you're like, I'm deathly afraid to change this. What if it works out?
That's why it's where I've pivoted, whether I'm in therapy or coaching. I've switched to like, what if it works out?
Yeah.
Like, yes, we're so great at doing all the detective work of like the fear. What could happen? Okay. What's the other side of that? Because it's on a scale. Life is on a scale. It could be absolute shit.
True.
Or it could be freaking lollipops and puppy dogs.
Yep.
Now, it's most of the time somewhere in the middle. But
a lollipop.
it's a puppy shitting on the carpet with a lollipop.
It's a blend.
It'll work. But see, this is the issue, is we get so stuck in absolutes. Like, it's this or it's this. Like, it's something I was thinking about the other day. Was I was talking to a coaching client, and he was talking about, he was on the phone. He's like, oh, give me a second. I got to go into the gas station and buy a lotto ticket. I'm like, oh, okay. And trust me, I buy lotto tickets too. I'm not against the lotto. But I was like, can I ask you, how hard was it for you to pull the trigger with doing coaching with me at the beginning? He's like, yeah, I probably thought about it for like over a year of just like with other people, like, and he's a great, like, he is the eternal learner. So he was like, who do I want to be with? Let me research their background, all sorts of stuff. And I said, have you ever given that same thought process to the amount of money you spend on lotto tickets?
Ooh.
And he like stopped for a second. I was like, I think you're getting me wrong. I'm not trying to say that you've got a gambling issue. What I'm saying is, I was like, but man, it's really easy for us to like, oh shoot, it's up to like almost a billion or whatever it is, and go ahead and drop $20 on a ticket, right? Like, no issue. But then if we like step back and said, okay, well, you had $250 for the year that you could invest in yourself, would you? Well, probably not. You'd probably buy another Apple TV or an Apple Watch, or you'd put that money towards something else, but you wouldn't actually like, oh, that's to actually grow me. Like, and so there's a lot of people out there that are living every day like a coin flip. Like, okay, I'm gonna put on my clothes, I'm gonna walk out the door, and either something good's gonna happen or it's gonna be a shitty day. I think you actually have the ability to affect more change than you really think you have.
Yeah, a lot of my clients, I'll tell them, and I'm tough. They know that. I take no shit, and I will push on them because it's about the behavior. It's not about me picking on someone or siding with someone. If you are doing the behavior that's leading to your destruction, I will call you out like Terminator. Like, that's enough. You can do this and be miserable, or you can do this. What is your choice? I'm here to support you, but if I'm working towards a goal that I think you told me in the beginning you want, and you're over here, it's going to feel really uncomfortable for us to work together or in friendships. If I think we're growing here and you just want to stay and party or whatever it might be, like, something's got to give, where if I'm coming to you and I'm telling you, like, here, and as the client is coming to me and telling me, here's what I want to do, here's what I want to work on, yet I'm sabotaging myself in all these ways, or I'm not willing to invest in myself in all these ways, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a shame thing. We might not be able to make the progress you're wanting to make if you're not willing to let go of the comfort and the familiarity that you've come to know. And so if you want to grow and change, you're going to have to grow and change. And we don't often realize that. I want to wake up one day with the remote from Click, the movie, and have everything be the way it is without having to do the work. I don't want to have to go through the pain of quitting my job and finding another one. I don't want to have to go through the pain of getting a divorce and finding somebody else. I don't want to have to go through the move, the rebirth and the phoenix rising from the ashes. It's fucking uncomfortable, but it's definitely worth it at the end of it. And if it feels like it's still shitty, keep going. You are not at the end with the light at the tunnel if it still is like, oh, this is so exhausting. Yeah, you're shedding multi-generations of identities. It's not going to be fun. I say it's a dramatic, transformational overhaul of your life. You will be drained, but it will be worth it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you've ever talked to someone who's done a remodel on their house, they will always tell you never again.
Yeah.
But then they sit in the positive consequences of that remodel, right?
Yeah.
Like going back to what you were saying, I love when people go, well, I don't want to go through all that. I don't want to experience all that. Well, then what you're really communicating to me is you don't want any of your potential growth or your future experiences to be sustainable. Because like there are those people that do have like miracles happen in their life and boom, something happens and man, now I've got financial freedom, or there was some sort of windfall, something happened. They have wonderful, a great period of time in life. Really, I could say a season, and it stays a season. Why? Because they don't have any of the growth that those hard times would have afforded them to maintain the joy they're now receiving. Because guess what? You might not imagine it this way, but literally people will have goodness step into their lives and they will cut it down and use it for firewood.
That's what we talked about.
And they'll go like, well, wait a second, where'd it all go? Like, you burned it. You legitimately burned it. Well, but that was my money tree. But you told yourself you needed heat more than you needed what X, Y, or Z was.
Yep.
So it's really what we're bringing here. This isn't hypothetical stuff. It's real life. It's applicable. And it has consequences if we don't know it exists. You know, it's sort of like emotional termites in your life. You can sit here and say everything's fine, but your walls are falling apart. And you're just waiting for the winds or the storm of that life to show you actually how exposed you always were, regardless of whether or not you were willing to look at it.
Yeah, what you were talking about moments ago brought up this. It's kind of like this concept I've been exploring. It's not that I want people to have to go through hardships by any means. It's not like I'm sitting here like a scared straight program, like meddling with my clients' lives to give them hardships to overcome. Like they usually have enough of it when they come in. I don't need to ever do that. That when you go through hardships, the lessons that you often learn through adversity or tough times, again, this is like with not abuse, not it. The lessons you learn through those tough times reframe your brain and they stick with you much differently. And the fear of being a motivation. I don't want to be in poverty again. I don't want to go on food stamps again. I don't want to question where my next meal is coming from again. If a business is built on that, or a framework or a life's wealth is amassed on that. One of my people I worked with years ago said a quote that stuck with me forever, that the chill of poverty never leaves your bones. And that fear of, I don't want to ever go back to that, despite probably 5, 10, 15, 20 years of evidence for most people and business owners, it's never going to be as bad as it was in the beginning. Here's data and proof. Here are your spreadsheets. Here are your analytics. Like, you don't have to fear it. That chill doesn't leave. That small Jimmy Cricket voice of like, you can't go back to this. That's incredibly motivating. Sometimes you burn out. I'm not saying it's always healthy, but it's incredibly motivating if you're in a deprivation state. I just taught this to my students this week. If you're in a deprivation state and your motivation is to get out of lack and into abundance and whatever, you will be motivated as you see it go. But there's going to be this fear of like, I can't go back to the end. I can't go back. And that's where you see these businesses explode because they're trying to get out of shit. I've talked about this for a long time. If all of your needs are met, motivation comes from a different place.
motivation is also harder, I feel like, to keep consistent when all your needs are met. Because I have a saying called fat, dumb, and happy. Like if we are fed, if the bank account's good, if we have no stressors in our life, it's hard to pull myself out of bed. Why am I motivated? You know,
if I need to scrape by or work as hard as I did to build it, to maintain it, what's my purpose? And I think after replanting the tree, it's deciding, what is my purpose now?
Yeah.
What am I going to use as my motivator moving forward?
Well, I mean, just pour them out there. Like whether it's Bill Gates, it's Jeff Bezos, it's Elon Musk, like go down the list. They all replanted their family trees. They all came from very different existences. And so what happens a lot is people will now look at them now and be like, oh, but they're on yachts and they've got this and they've got all this money. And they forget that that's actually the consequences of their behaviors. And I know like people are going, Adam, why do you say consequences? Because consequences are positive or negative. Yeah,
I teach this a lot. It's the outcome.
And so like the more that you're actually accepting of the words consequences and discipline, probably the better off your life is going to be. Because when we talk about discipline, especially in coaching or therapy, most people will be like, oh, I hate discipline. I don't want discipline is such a bad thing. No, you're like recoiling from the trauma of like maybe physical abuse or people who didn't know how to use discipline. So you believe that being corrected or being taught to be disciplined is negative. But what you're actually communicating to me through your life is that your life is lacking discipline. You don't hold yourself accountable to routines, to procedures, to systems that would allow you to be more efficient, because you simply look across and go, well, that looks nasty. Well, this also looks hard too. It looks hard to live a life of constant chaos where you feel like you're moving through the crisis of the week. You're tipping cows every week. We have got to get to the ability to sit back and go, okay, well, just because I recognize through my parents or my grandparents or people that I love that they have utilized poor uses of discipline and consequences and all sorts of things, doesn't mean that then I'm able to actually tell myself, well, I don't have to play by those rules. And I think that you've got a whole heck of a lot of people out there that are living their lives like ostriches, where their heads are buried in the sand. They're hoping that time alone is going to wash away their troubles. And then one day they're going to give themselves permission. And at the very end, in 5 minutes, they're going to be able to put their life on a good track. And that's typically, I see more resentful people from that than I see people that are grounded in actually feeling like they've accomplished something.
And with that kind of that head in the sand and thinking about it as a consequence, like everything has a consequence. A consequence is an effect or an outcome of an action or a choice. That's the literal definition. I think maybe I messed one word up, but that's pretty much the literal dictionary definition. You can have positive consequences, negative consequences, self-imposed consequences, natural consequences, other imposed consequences. I prefer to encourage my clients, and all my teens who've worked with me know this, if you're going to make a decision, I'm not your parent. I cannot modify and have you live a perfect life, nor is that my job or goal. If you want to make a quote unquote poor decision or risky decision, my rule for you is that you must do the research. What would the fine be? What would the penalty be? What would the outcome be of your trust with your relationship with your parents? Because they're probably not thinking about that because the frontal lobe's not fully kicked on. I make them go through all of that. And believe it or not, with a very high success rate, they will come back and be like, so I had this drive to do this, this urge to do that. And then I did what you said with the checklist because I built trust and rapport with them. And they know I'm not going to bullshit them. I care about them. And they come and they're like, yeah, I figured it wasn't worth it. It doesn't mean their drive to do the thing went away. They didn't want to pay the price or the outcome. And sometimes they did come in and they're like, I still did it. But because I had researched it, I didn't do it for the full stop. I ended up telling my parents after, so my consequence with them was less. Like, I'm not trying to instill fear. I'm trying to instill, if it's going to be a decision, make it a well-informed decision so you prevent yourself from kicking yourself. You don't spend too much time in the research phase, but don't kick yourself for it. Do the research, set a timer. All right, and this is the decision I'm making. And if this doesn't work, I'll make another one. But if it does work, I can check this off my list forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're considering replanting your family tree, without knowing more, I'm going to generally say podcast enthusiasm, go for it.
Yeah.
Do it. Go buy some soil, Go get some gardening gloves and get at it.
Exactly. Well, because again, truly look at what are the risks. What are the risks of if I do it? What's the risks if I don't do it?
Yeah.
And I think that, again, I've sat with so many people who they've spent good chunks of their life living a life that wasn't necessarily representative of them, but was what other people wanted for them.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that's very, very hard to do over a course of a long period of time.
The motivation leaves. You're not living for you.
Nope.
You wake up one day and you're like, who am I? Who are you? What am I doing here? What life am I living?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Better to wake yourself up to that than one day the natural consequence, it just arrives at you and you can't stop it any longer. You can only ignore something for so long before it starts screaming at you, literally or figuratively.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think we've dumped enough on you guys for today.
Yeah. Go to your therapist, because I know I need to process a lot that came up.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And thank you for listening. If you made it this far, the biggest way that you can let us know if you liked it is commenting, like, rate, subscribe, share this episode with your friends.
Absolutely.
With whoever might need to hear it. And we appreciate you next time.